Okay, hello, welcome to our conversation about European climate fiction presented by Literarisches Colloquium Berlin, LCB, and the Free University Berlin. My name is Elisa Primavera-Lévy. I'm an editor at the literary journal Sim-Inform, and I'm very happy to welcome and introduce our three guests today. So, Vicki Jarrett below me is joining us from Scotland. She's a novelist and short story writer, and her latest novel, Always North, was published in 2019. It is based on a short story of the same title, and it has two different settings, like time and place, right? One is the first part is in 2025, in the Arctic summer, on an oil survey ship. And the second part, or like actually parts 3 and 4, are 20 years later in 2045 in the Scottish Highlands, already in a post-apocalyptic society due to runaway climate change. There's also a time-traveling polar bear, so this is clearly a fantastic element about which we might talk a little bit later. And yeah, it has been called psychological climate fiction, speculative fiction. Okay. Our second guest is Julia Fiedorczuk, poet from Poland. She's also the author of 2 novels. She's a translator. She's next to me. She also teaches American literature at Warsaw University. She has specialized in eco-criticism and has widely published on the subject. And you also have an internet platform, right, called ecopoetics?
Yes.
Okay. So we wanted to talk with Julia today because of her collection of poems, Psalmi and English Psalms, in which she does many interesting things, but she also gives a voice to the disenfranchised, to plants, to animals, even to bacteria, to urban city dwellers, to lost ecosystems and lost species. And yeah, and she does so with never moralizing and also not by identifying with nature. So we want to talk about this today. And our third guest, also next to Vicki, is María Bonete Escoto. She's joining us from Spain. You write fiction and short stories and also essays about many cultural issues, even computer games, which I find very interesting. Mm-hmm. And we want to talk with you today about your short story, Lunes, Monday in English, which was published in 2018 in an anthology of Spanish climate fiction called Estío, Summer. So, and yes, so Maria, I want to start with you and with a general question that is often brought up with regard to climate fiction, namely on the possible influence of climate fiction or speculative fiction on readers' perceptions of climate change. There is a famous quote, a famous saying by Lawrence Buell, who coined the term of eco-criticism, like the crisis of the environment is a crisis of the imagination. And so eco-critics somehow think, or like they hope, that there is a possibility to change people's perception by giving them like different perspectives. So literature has some power, narrative has power, and poetry as well. And many writers of climate fiction also write with an activist bent, right? They're trying to, well, somehow they're hoping to alert their readers to a looming future, to the imminent dangers that are becoming ever more certain, but readers might not be aware of. But other writers are also more attracted to writing climate fiction because it offers specific aesthetic possibilities or specific psychological richness, right? If you describe a protagonist, maybe who is in this peculiar psychological twilight between recognition and denial, or just a protagonist who is coping with catastrophe. So the question is, if you look at your own work, how would you, if Lunas, right, and maybe you can talk a little bit about Lunas in answering this question, how would you position yourself between these rather idealized two poles that I presented right now?
Well, I think I would say there's an activist bent in my work. Mm-hmm. Not because, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right?
Yes.
Okay. Because when I wrote Lunes, it was partly inspired by my own experiences. Back then I was working as kind of, as a government employee. I was interning at my university's administration office. So all the interactions that with other people that appear in the short story are kind of inspired by the people I met while I was working there. And it also is inspired by my hometown, by the place I'm staying in right now, actually. Mm-hmm. Because it's the classic Spanish coastal seaside town that's completely focused on tourism, and its environment has degraded for the past 50 or so years. So it was, and also like my own feelings. So I wouldn't say impotence, but it's kind of like that, because like you can, like you kind of try to deal with these things you can't really change, and it's I don't know, it's a really like the story deals with a really normal day for its main character. And my idea with that was to show that even if you, like when the worst has already happened, life kind of goes on, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. So, but yes, I mean, it. When I think about it, it's kind of depressing, because like it doesn't really have like a really conclusive happy ending. But I don't think that's necessarily pessimistic or anything. Like life goes on. This is the world we have to work with right now, so we might as well try to do something with it.
So, can you tell a little bit about the plot? So your protagonist is a young lady who's working in an office, right? And
yeah, like something weird happened with a hotel that was being built out in the beach. So that happened a number of years ago, and her job is to deal with all the little things that have been going wrong for the last few years in that town. I think it has a kind of a speculative fiction, new, weird kind of bent, or at least that was kind of what I was thinking about. So back then I was really into, Jeff Vandermeer's Area X and all that kind of, it's one of my favorite books, so I was kind of thinking about that. And sorry, I just lost myself a bit, sorry. And she's, her job is to kind of take all these complaints and then send them off to another organism that actually tries to do something about them. It's also a bit like how everything works here in Spain, I guess, and I think everywhere else. Like you have a complaint, you go to a government office, and then they send you to another government office, and then that place is closed, and then you have to go back. It's also inspired by another short story by a romanticism Spanish writer, mm-hmm. who has a little story called "Please Come Back Tomorrow." So it's that's also kind of my inspiration. And so the story about this girl, this woman, going back to her hometown and having to find a job with the government and try to do something she didn't really study for, she doesn't really want to do either, and just try to buy her time until she can move from that place.
All right, thank you. So it's a huge apparatus of bureaucracy, right? And that is trying to deal with this catastrophe that happened. You never really say in your story what happened, so this remains totally in the dark. Strange things are happening all the way, and it becomes totally clear that this bureaucracy is not suited to deal with the situation, right? People are basically on their own, but somehow life goes on. Thank you. Julia, it is often said that climate change is an invisible enemy, right? That it somehow defies representation. Personally, I don't agree, but this is brought up on and on. And so the challenge for literature is somehow to find images, symbols, aesthetic ways of conveying this imperceptible process of climate change. So I wanted to ask you, as a writer, do you agree, is there like a particular, do you feel that climate change represents a particular challenge in terms of its representability? And if so, how do you go about this? Do you have any aesthetic strategies?
Yeah. Not necessarily in the sense that it's imperceptible, because of course it is very clearly perceptible nowadays in many places. Even in our countries, yes, because obviously climate change is perceptible and brutally felt in places like Bangladesh, for instance, yes, or some countries in Asia or Africa. But even in Europe, we have forest fires, we have these heat waves, and Poland is beginning to have problems with water, and many people still don't accept this as a result of climate change, but we are going to be in trouble when it comes to water very soon. So there are all these things that are happening that we can actually see, but I think the problem lies elsewhere. The problem lies, first of all, in the immense complexity of the climate system. The climate science is actually quite difficult. It is quite difficult to understand how climate works and how climate change works and how causality works, like what kind of processes trigger other kinds of processes, why it accelerates, and so on and so forth. This is really complicated, and even us, we sometimes, the ones that think about this on daily basis, and the ones that do not negate climate change, even we often lack knowledge and the ability to explain what is actually happening, why climate is not the same as temperature, because people will say, well, look, it's so cold and you're telling me about climate change. But people confuse climate with the weather, or people don't realize that when it rains, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have enough water in the soil, for instance. So these processes are not very easy. The science itself is not very easy. It's quite complex. And the network of dependencies between various phenomena and processes is so complex that is something which I think is not easy to represent. We have these diagrams. So the scientists will show us diagrams that correlate, for example, the levels of greenhouse emissions and the levels of temperature. But, people look at these diagrams, and diagrams don't talk to our emotions. They don't do anything on the level of affect, yes? Or you have numbers of refugees somewhere in the world, but once again, numbers don't speak to us. Maybe numbers such as 6 or 7 tell us something, but numbers such as 5,000 no longer mean anything to human beings. So just the scale, I would say, of what is happening in terms of both complexity and just the massive change that is taking place, this is something that evidently constitutes a problem for the human imagination, because it seems like we are more or less traumatized at the moment by the change, since it seems like there are not too many people who are actually denying climate change. Because if you talk to people, even in Poland, which has this really awful government right now, and which is really not doing well when it comes to taking care of its environment. But even in my country, when you talk to people, most people realize that this problem exists. Most people will not deny climate change, but somehow it doesn't register on this deeply emotional level, or it doesn't register deeply enough or clearly enough for people to be able to take action, or even to start talking about it in clear terms. So
is there something literature can do about this, like especially at this point?
Well, I think,
simply put.
Yeah, I think, sorry, that was a very long digression. I think literature can, I'm not sure what it can do, but I'm sure that it can try. First of all, to name the problem clearly, so that we actually say it out loud, that we have a problem, that this hot summer is not just weather, and it's not just that we're having nice holidays. So that's one thing. Another thing is to, because literature can experiment, like speculative fiction, for example. Yes, you're free to experiment, you're free to imagine things. We can try to imagine the world in which, for example, the language of economy is not the only, important language. Because right now, the language of economy has become our meta language, and not just of economy, but the language of growth, right, has become this universal meta language. So anything you're talking about, it has to find a kind of economic justification. Why not ecological? Why shouldn't, well, I think ecology should be our meta language. So like anything we're talking about, we should be talking about ecology, because that's really the foundation for life, for our survival, for the survival of this civilization. Yes. So I think literature is wonderful because it gives you the freedom to imagine solutions other than this dystopia. I mean, dystopias are important, yes, but utopias as well, right? Alternatives, other solutions. And also, I started this lengthy ramble from speaking about the immense complexity of climate, but that applies generally to life on this planet. It's a very complex, life relies on a very complex network of dependencies. I think literature, because literature is also complex, and it's also a kind of an ecosystem, and I think it is especially, in my case, I think poetry is especially well prepared to address the question of complexity, to address the question of the interconnectedness of phenomena, of beings, of meanings. And so in this sense, I think it's also a great tool for exploring these things and for experimenting with the ways of living.
Vicki, a question for you. But living in the Anthropocene is often associated with a peculiar sense of time and space, or like with a disorientation in spatial and temporal orders. So this is most palpable when we think about the future, right? Like if we imagine the future, we can no longer imagine it without fear, and I think that also does something to our temporal perception generally. So also in your short story and in your novel Always North, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about this peculiar temporality that is perceived by those people on the oil vessel survey, like they are always like in this Arctic summer, right? The sun never sets, and slowly the entire crew is somehow losing it. So just wanted you to go a little bit on with this.
Sure. Well, certainly the time aspect was one of the things I was really interested in, how people view climate change and so on, because it does happen over such huge timescales. Yeah. And as human beings, we're still operating with this kind of Neanderthal brain, and that's best suited to immediate risk, identifiable threats. There's an animal's about to eat me. I'm going to do this. So we have a real problem thinking outside of our own, certainly our own lifetimes. So being able to see the future and to actually care about it enough is, I think, where storytellers and poets and so on maybe do have a role, because we can't actually rewire our, Neanderthal brains to be able to cope with time in a more useful way. But what we can do is use story and that emotional connection to kind of allow people to kind of expand their perceptions, be a little bit more flexible in the way they can think about time and causality, as Julia mentioned, and their kind of potential role in this. People do find it very difficult to engage with statistics and graphs and so on. Certainly not in the same visceral way that is really necessary now, and if there's going to be any action taken. But I think it's all part of this kind of larger conversation. Sorry, just touching on your first question, I think I wouldn't describe myself as an activist or a politician or anything like that. I am primarily, a creative individual.
Right.
And so I didn't come to this work with an agenda. The agenda kind of happened to me because I was coming at it from a human angle, and it's hard to ignore. And this is this thing that you mentioned of the constant daylight of the far north during that half of my book. Is I did come to see that as a sort of persistence of vision, like there's no night, it's just daylight all the time, and so what's in front of you, you can't avoid it. It's permanently there. You don't get to go to it to get dark and pretend you can't see it. It's just there. And that began to feel quite like our kind of reality at the moment, with climate sort of breakdown and so on, as was mentioned as well. It's very visible. You can't not see it. And I think this is why more and more artists and creatives of all sorts, not just writers, are engaging now with this, because it's right there. It's the biggest thing that's happening really to our world, our ultimate survivability in it. And you just get to the point where it's impossible not to engage with it.
Yeah. Well, just another question, because I perceive your work is grounded in genre fiction, right? I mean, you use a lot of elements of genre fiction and different things, very interesting things with it. It's basically a question for you and Maria, because climate change is clearly the greatest challenge of our times, and yet there seems to be a sense among some critics and also some highbrow writers that writers have not responded to climate change imaginatively, or have not really responded actively enough. And Margaret Atwood, for example, said something along these lines, which I found surprising, because if you look at literature, at the development, there have been, for example, myriads of works of genre fiction that have been published since the 1990s that all deal with climate change, in different ways. So I wondered, maybe this charge of Atwood and other critics is just not correct, or it is just charged against more highbrow literature, or is genre fiction, is it maybe more suited to dealing with climate change? So this is something I just wanted to present for general discussion.
Yeah. Should I carry on, or do you? Okay. It's interesting that you mentioned genre. I didn't write in genre before. My first novel and my short story collection were much more, I suppose you would call, mainstream literary fiction, for want of a better label. But I think genre fiction, speculative fiction, it deals with climate change and possible futures by definition, much better. But I think as the reality of the situation comes closer and closer to us, that the lines between what we would call genre fiction and literary fiction are becoming blurred, because we are starting to write about our current reality. This isn't imagined anymore, you know. I've gone, what, 25 years or so into the future. That's not far. It's not, you know, another world, another fantastical reality. Although the time traveling polar bear is possibly crossing some lines there. But yeah, I think it's largely academic, these decisions, these divisions between genre and non-genre and so on. And some people get very obsessed with that idea, but I would completely refute Margaret Atwood's assertion that writers haven't responded. I think they really have. There's been some fantastic books, and not just very recently. There's loads, absolutely loads. I could mention The Road, Cormac McCarthy, Station 11, Emily St. John Mandel. I mean, Margaret Atwood's work herself, maybe, you know, on the Mad Adam trilogy, I absolutely loved that. And Jeff Vandermeer, of course, is huge at the moment. And there's lots going on, and more as it impinges more on the general consciousness, I think.
Maria, do you want to add on this?
I found this question kind of funny, because a couple of weeks ago I was invited to a podcast to talk about video games and climate change. And one of the questions was why in like big games, big name games, the ones like that take a lot of money to produce and things like that, why climate change isn't really like a popular theme in those kinds of games. Yes. And the thing is, it's starting to be kind of the themes. Like maybe you've heard of Horizon Zero Dawn. But the thing is that in smaller games, cheaper games that deal with things of like building little towns and things like that, it's always been there. So I think I personally find it kind of funny how it's always been there, but maybe we haven't really looked in the right places. And apart from that, I agree with Vicki. Like, I mean, I think it's starting to permeate in literary fiction, the fact that climate change is a thing and we have to deal with it, whether we want it or not. And that I also find it interesting that when Estío was published in Spain 2 years ago, there was nothing like that at all. Like it was like the first anthology or novel or anything that dealt with climate change and things like that in Spain. Wow. But right now there are, I think at least a couple more that are going to be published this year. So I think it's slow going, but it's going to happen sometime.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting. Julia, I read that you came up with the idea of a writing school, an ecopoetic writing school. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's not a writing school, but it is a school for writers, for journalists, for artists. It is we call it a school of ecopoetics, and it's a school which we established with a friend of mine who is a Polish nonfiction writer, journalist, Filip Springer. And the first edition of the school consists of 10 weekend sessions, during which we read and discuss texts, but we also travel together, we sleep in the tents, we spend hours of silence together, we go to different places in Poland, both beautiful places and places which are extremely destroyed by, for example, open pit coal mining. We went to Konin, which is like one of the most devastated area in Poland by coal mining. So we do all these things, we experience these things together, we do the thinking, we do the talking, but we also do, you know, a kind of silent meditation and hiking and just being together in order to very thoroughly rework the ways in which we think and talk about ourselves in relation to the modern human world, to what is called the environment. And so the idea is that the people who are the students in the school, then they go on to do their different jobs, and they are journalists. This was very important to me because I think reporting about the environment is very often not of good quality, with very little understanding of what's happening. So we have reporters, but we also have lawyers, we also have therapists, and all of these people, they go on to do their different jobs, whatever it is that they are whatever it is that they're doing. They do this having had this experience of a very thorough sort of thinking through with a group of like-minded individuals these fundamental problems. So the like when it comes to the academic side of the school, it has elements of eco-criticism, and it has elements of ecopoetics, but understood like Aristotle understood poetics. Poetics as poiesis, as making, right? So we ask this question about the composition of the world. How do we make the world on a spiritual level? Yes, because the world is not just made by means of technology. We don't just make home on this planet by means of technology. We also make home on this planet by means of stories and metaphors. Metaphor is a kind of powerful technology in a way. So we deal with metaphors, we deal with stories, we deal with these tools for homemaking on the planet Earth. And homemaking, when you look at the words ecopoetics, when you look at the Greek etymology of these words, it means exactly homemaking, right? So the school of ecopoetics is like the school of homemaking. It's not about writing poetry, but it's on this deeper level of engaging with metaphors and stories. And then, some people will write.
They will also write. So that's also part of the package. Like they can write if they feel inclined to do so.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's not a creative writing school. Yes, it's more like a school of thinking,
interesting,
and experimenting, and yeah.
All right. So I think we need to come to a close. Thank you all very much for participating in this conversation, and I hope we can continue this some other time, some other place, because we need to, I guess.
Yeah. Thank you for asking.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It was really great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you all for being here.